My name is Mark Webber. I'm the head of the School Government Society, and it gives me considerable pleasure to see you all here at the inaugural event of the Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security. And the session, I guess, in some ways is a corrective to the one I came in halfway through just now, which seemed less about cooperation and more about possibilities of conflict. The theme of the session now is to do with the possibilities for trust and diplomacy. And to explore those themes, we have three people on the panel. Nick Wheeler, who is the inaugural director of the ICCS. And if you ever send Nick an email and get a response, there's enough on his signature for a short biography, so I don't think I need to repeat all that here. As well as the inaugural director, he's Professor of International Politics here at the University of Birmingham, and you all know him, of course, for books he's written on things like Saving Strangers, The Security Dilemma, and so on. And he will be first up, and secondly is Naomi, who is lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and I think I'm safe in saying is also the inaugural honorary fellow of the ICCS, so it's very good to have you here in that capacity as well. She has written on critical theory on Kosovo and on Rwanda, and is currently collaborating with Nick on some projects, one of which kept them busy behind closed curtains most of yesterday in the office next door to mine, but I could hear the typewriter tapping away. And then thirdly, Sir Richard Dalton, former UK ambassador to Iran and also to Libya, with a distinguished and lengthy career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and since 2006 he's been an associate fellow on the Middle East and the North African programme at Chatham House in London. So each person has an allotted 12 minutes, as precise as that, or so, and we'll take them in order, and then there'll be time for questions near the end. We will run over 6 o'clock, and we will take it as long as I think we can. Okay, so Nick, it's over to you first.
Thank you, Mark. So what I want to do in the short time I have available is explore the possibilities for achieving mutual security between Iran and its key Western negotiating partners in relation to the nuclear issue. I want to explore in the first part of my paper why achieving mutual security has proved so elusive, and in the second part of my paper, I hope provide a bridge to some of the things Naomi is going to talk about, consider very briefly whether the Istanbul talks a couple of weeks ago suggest that a new path to mutual security is opening up. Conceptually, my paper draws on the notion of the security dilemma in international relations theory, and crucially the question of whether and how two adversaries with peaceful and defensive motives can, to use the language of US security dilemma theorists, signal their type as benign actors to each other. Because if you knew with perfect certainty, of course, that the other side had peaceful defensive motives, then there would be no security dilemma. But the problem is, of course, that we can never have that level of assurance. And as a result, governments have to resolve what Ken Booth and I, in the book that Mark kindly just mentioned, called dilemmas of interpretation and dilemmas of response. Now imagine for a moment the decision makers in State A have resolved this dilemma of interpretation about the motives and intentions of another state in favour of the view that that state is an aggressor and responding by building up countervailing military capabilities. Now that's certainly, for example, how Israel, as we talked about, and the Bush administration has assessed the Iranian threat. In both cases, policymakers have believed that Iran's acquisition of fuel cycle capabilities is leading it inexorably to become a nuclear weapons state. And this has been seen as posing an existential threat, as we heard about earlier this afternoon. So as a consequence of that, any level of enrichment on Iranian soil has been viewed as a red line in the negotiations that have taken place during the 2000s. The only way that the Western players have believed that they could be secure in the face of the developing Iranian nuclear program has been that if Tehran was to give up the development of the most proliferation-sensitive part of the fuel cycle. Now, if these perceptions of Iran's aggressive intent are accurate, then there's clearly no path to mutual security. But of course, there is the question about, even if we believe that Iran is developing the capability to make a bomb, but has not actually made the decision to build one, are we to rule out the possibility that that motivation is actually defensive? That actually the reason why Iran wants to put itself into a position of either nuclear latency, or indeed even to develop a weapon, is because it sees it as a hedge against an uncertain world. Now, the argument that the Islamic Republic might want a nuclear hedge, and we heard this afternoon a number of times about the kind of neighbourhood that Iran finds itself in, not a particularly good one, is an argument that we in the UK should be familiar with. After all, it's the ultimate rationale provided by Tony Blair for Britain continuing as a nuclear weapon state into the second half of the 21st century. Blair said that the only certainty in this world, when he announced the decision in Parliament in December 2006, is uncertainty. And in his memoir, he made that argument as well. And Winston Churchill, of course, once described the advent of thermonuclear weapons as the great equaliser. So, given the Supreme Leader's fear that Washington is intent on regime change, is it really surprising that Iran wants a nuclear hedge? But of course, if maintaining some level of indigenous enrichment capability is seen as vital to Iran's security, but it's also been a red line for the Western negotiating partners, then there doesn't seem to be a route by which we can actually get to mutual security. So even if we make the assumption that both sides have peaceful defensive motives, they appear to be trapped in a vicious circle of spiralling insecurity, as each perceives the other's position on the nuclear issue as posing a threat to their own core security interests. Put differently, neither has been able to signal their type as peaceful and defensive because the steps necessary to reassure the other side have been seen as too costly to risk if it turns out that the other side does in fact have aggressive motives and intent. And this is where the security dilemma reveals itself at its most poignant in international politics. Now, it's because of uncertainty, because we can never ultimately know the intentions of others, the motives and intentions of others, that we run into this fundamental problem. In a situation where I, as a security seeker, am trying to communicate that to a rival, but do it in such a way that it doesn't require actions that could jeopardise my security. So, even if diplomats and state leaders can do what Herbert Butterfield, that pioneering figure in the history of the security dilemma, said was impossible, and enter into the counter-fear of their adversaries, is this always going to be enough to unlock the key to mutual security? And I think this is what makes the Iranian nuclear case such a hard nut to crack. Because even if both sides can appreciate the fears of the other, and there has been precious little of that, it's not evident that each of them can find a path to security that will make the other insecure without them feeling that makes them insecure. So what finally then of the Istanbul talks 2 weeks ago and the promise of the Baghdad ones next month? Do the talks suggest that there is a way of both sides increasing each other's security? The commentary before, during and after the negotiations suggested that the Obama administration had mapped out a significant confidence-building measure to bridge the trust gap, language which has been used in the recent discussions. The idea being, in a nutshell, that Iran would halt production of 20% enriched uranium at its heavily protected Fordo plant and reduce its existing stockpile of 20% enriched uranium by transferring it to France and Russia for conversion into fuel for the Tehran research reactor, thereby resurrecting part of the deal that had originally been on the table in October 2009, and which Scott mentioned this afternoon. What is not clear, though, is what Iran would gain in return for making such a move. And Adam talked about the possibility that Iran might make that move and the political context in which it could come about. Some have suggested that the eventual deal would legitimise Iran enriching to 3.5% at its Natanz plant. Yet this in turn would require Iran coming clean on its past activities, and this of course raises major trust issues. Does the Supreme Leader trust the West to keep to any amnesty rather than exploit it to legitimise new sanctions? Others have suggested that Iran would want far more than that if it were to make such a concession, and attention here is focused, of course, on the impending oil embargo which the Europeans are to impose in July. But again, is the promise of harm to be averted enough to persuade the Supreme Leader to make such a conciliatory move? Or, if, as I would argue, Khamenei is operating with an inherent bad faith model of US motives, then will he just see any concession as the thin end of the wedge? Persuading Iranian leaders that that kind of bad faith thinking is not justified becomes so much harder then when viewed in the context of the claim by Western governments that it's the policy of sanctions and ultimately the threat of force which has brought Tehran to the negotiating table. This too might be viewed as an example of bad faith thinking. The idea that the only motivation behind any conciliatory policy on the part of Tehran would be one of fear. What is missing from the policy of Western governments is an appreciation of how far their own actions have contributed to Iran's feelings of fear and insecurity. What Ken Booth and I in our book call the exercise of security dilemma sensibility, an awareness of how these spirals of insecurity can develop. And the more Western policymakers emphasise the importance of threats in producing beneficial changes in Iranian policy, the more, I would argue, the Iranian leadership will cling to its nuclear hedge and all the associated facilities, capabilities, and all the rest of it that we've talked about. And as a consequence, the more distant the promise of mutual nuclear security will be between the two sides. Thank you.
Nick, thanks very much. Straight over to Naomi. As I mentioned, Naomi and Nick are currently working on a joint article on exactly this theme, so I guess the things you're talking about will be similar.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Asaf and Nick as well for inviting me to speak today. I want to begin my remarks today with a few quotations. And first of all, I want to quote the 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who said, when speaking of the indigenous peoples in the New World, and I quote, "I think there is nothing barbarous and savage in that nation, from what I have been told, except that each man calls barbarism whatever is not his own practice. For indeed it seems we have no other test of truth and reason than the example and pattern of the opinions and customs of the country we live in." In line with Montaigne's writings hundreds of years earlier, Robert Jervis has more recently argued that if people do not learn enough from what happens to others, they learn too much from what happens to themselves. And to quote finally the words of Condoleezza Rice, more recently, who commented when some of the European governments didn't support the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, I'll put it very bluntly, we simply didn't understand it. Now, what these quotations all have in common, I would suggest, is a sense of the limitations, both unconscious and otherwise, imposed upon our understanding of the world and each other. And I have observed, what I would like to think anyway, is an emerging trend in the commentary and analysis on the current crisis and negotiations with Iran, which calls for a consideration of alternative ways of approaching the issue. I've observed some of these calls coming from the work of the Oxford Research Group, for example, from the writings of Richard Dalton, from Peter Jenkins, former UK ambassador to the IAEA, from other Western diplomats, from former Iranian negotiators and diplomats, and in the writings of practitioners and scholars on these issues. All of these voices, in a variety of ways, have called attention to the futility of increasing sanctions and the dangers of escalating tension in a volatile region through misconceptions, stereotypes, misperceptions, demonization, hostile rhetoric, and military posturing which has taken place by all sides. Many of these voices have drawn attention to the absence of diplomatic relations between the US and Iran over the last 30 years, and the consequences of this in terms of our ability to really understand the Iranian context, to the failure of coercive diplomacy since 2006, and to the need to question definitions of rationality and the role of emotions in shaping our beliefs, our national narratives, and our responses to what appears to be at times an intractable conflict. So if we are to challenge the process of negotiations as business as usual, in the interests instead of building a relationship embedded in a sense of mutual security and cooperation for both Western countries and Iran, what might such alternative path look like? In what I consider to be an inspirational appeal to those engaged in conflict transformation and peace building, Jean-Paul Lederach has articulated the need to open our imaginations as well as our minds when it comes to thinking about constructive social change and breaking cycles of violence. While the techniques and skills of mediation, negotiation, and diplomacy remain important, the crux of conflict transformation lies in our moral imagination, and he defines this as, and I quote, "the capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist." He understands imagination and transcendence as a messy, personal, timely, and indeed time-consuming process of innovation and creation, a complex and dynamic process which neither ignores the existing hard realities of conflict and politics, but neither does it consider itself bound or determined by them. In Lederach's terms, the moral imagination, and I quote, "requires the capacity to imagine ourselves in a web of relationships that includes our enemies, the ability to sustain a paradoxical curiosity that embraces complexity without reliance on dualistic polarities, the fundamental belief in and pursuit of the creative act, and the acceptance of the inherent risk of stepping into the mystery of the unknown that lies beyond the far too familiar landscape of violence." Now, in what might be considered as highlighting the need for such imaginative thinking, the former US Ambassador John Limbert said in March of last year that we have used sanctions because it is a tool that we know. Changing the unproductive relationship with Iran that we've had for the last 30 years, now that we do not know how to do. Bearing in mind the high stakes over the current negotiations with Iran in Istanbul and moving on into the future, it seems timely to ask how we might begin to imagine ourselves in a relationship with Iran that accepts the complexity of the needs and interests of all sides without being determined by the habitual rhetoric of the other as enemy. So if we consider the moral imagination as a guiding light in an architecture of conflict transformation, I want to suggest that the concepts of trust, empathy, and dialogue offer a concrete language with which we may be able to contribute towards creative approaches to conflict and the transformation of relations with Iran. What do I mean by these terms, and how might they help us? They help in two ways, I suggest. First of all, as both a critical tool for analysis after the fact, and secondly, as a normative guide for thinking differently in the present moment. So trust, first of all. Briefly, it's increasingly recognised in the field of security studies that trust building is at the heart of mutual security. Without trust, we find it very difficult to move beyond the worst interpretations of the security dilemma. While there are variations in what constitutes trust building, moving from gradual strategies to more radical leaps of faith, what's central to these processes is a sense of accepting a degree of risk to move beyond violent conflict. It's been stated by numerous parties in the context of Iran that trust or mistrust lies at the heart of the matter in this case. The mistrust is mutual and forms the core of the intractability of the conflict. Dialogue, then, secondly, a reflexive and critical ethic of communication sensitizes us to the ways in which legitimacy is sought and obtained within negotiations. It directs our attention to processes of inclusion and exclusion. It highlights the social and political harm that comes from the failure to recognize the perceptions and feelings of others. It questions the legitimacy of preconditions set before parties sit down at the negotiating table. It also raises issues concerned with coercion, which encompasses not just structural violence but also the procedural parameters established for negotiations, such as agenda setting, control over time, place, and of course the use of the threat of force. In other words, it suggests ways in which negotiations can be made fairer and more legitimate, both of which are factors that are crucial to long-term and lasting negotiations. Thirdly, then, empathy. Empathy calls for us to stand in the shoes of the other, to look at the world from the perspective of others. It demands of us a recognition of the relational dynamic of our interactions. In other words, it draws our attention to the impact of the messages, the signals of the interactions and negotiations which comprise our relationship. In understanding how others might perceive their own situation, and by therefore extension us, we can see how any consideration of reflexive communication and trust building also requires the exercise of empathy. Stephen Walt has recently suggested that one game-changing move in the context of Iran would be for the US to remove the military option from the table. We've heard already today that military options remaining firmly on the table, they're the source of much discussion. Many are indeed publicly advocating preventive war against Iran. And in this context, it's difficult to see why Iran and its leaders should be convinced of our sincerity and our commitment to dialogue and constructive confidence-building measures. Indeed, we could argue that such a threat only provides further incentive to developing a nuclear breakout capacity. Removing military options, then, would be a welcome gesture, and it would be a significant confidence-building move. But much more, I want to suggest, is necessary. To break these kinds of cycles of violence, we as actors have to recognise our own involvement in and our perpetuation of such cycles of violence. Only when we look at these actions in the context of a broader, long-term pattern can we understand that how we choose to respond has consequences and implications which extend beyond the immediate facts and become embedded in historical narratives which are subject to multiple and diverging interpretations. Historical narratives and the emotions embedded in them have played a significant role in the failure of the previous negotiations with Iran. And so it seems fair to suggest that building a qualitatively different kind of relationship requires us to acknowledge and to address some of the ghosts in the room. Now, many of these sources of historical mistrust have their origins beyond the nuclear program, which is currently the focus of so much attention. But it seems apt to suggest that negotiations with Iran will not be successful overnight, as is often demanded by politicians. And in terms of the current negotiations, success on this round of negotiations, I think, must be granted time to come up with rapid judgments of success or failure, and not necessarily conducive to building trust. Attention should also be paid to the construction of the process itself. Attention to how the negotiation process is taking place, under what circumstances and conditions do the parties meet. And here I wonder whether there is greater room for imagination concerning these kinds of procedural elements. A constructive dialogue also needs to function on more levels than simply the official negotiation, where we tend to see the most political posturing, and we tend to see the most time constraints placed on official negotiations. And this suggests looking at the possibilities of Track 2, potential and existing Track 2 and civil society avenues. And finally, in the context of these negotiations, what success looks like, I think, has shifted in this round of negotiations for both sides. The biggest factors, I think, probably being the mutual lifting of preconditions, or at least publicly, prior to the talks, and the potential for the West to agree to a limited enrichment by Iran, which significantly changes what's been said before. So to finish then, I want to suggest that exercising empathy and a greater degree of reflexivity within communicative practices might offer scope for even greater traction to emerge on the previously fixed and oppositional positions that have characterised both Iran and Western countries.
Naomi, thank you. Our final session from Richard Dalton has perhaps the most terse but apposite title, and is the punchline, I guess, to the whole afternoon's considerations. Is there a diplomatic solution? So,
thank you very much. I've given you a couple of bits of paper to take away. One is a shot at what might happen over 2012, 2013, where I've assigned some probabilities. That helps explain the context as I see it. And secondly, a document called 9 Years of Effort Already Tried. And that rather tortuous title is because if you put N, Y, E, and T together, you get NYET. And that has actually been the net result of 9 years of effort. So I'm not going to take you through all this, but if you want to challenge me about any of the judgments or ask about the content of some of these methods that have been tried in the past, I'm obviously happy to do so. Now, is there a diplomatic solution? Well, clearly there's three answers: yes, no, and possibly. And put my cards on the table, I'm definitely in the yes camp, but I would have to say yes, but. And I hope to give you a clear idea at the end of my talk what the but is all about. So we start with the setting. We've heard about the impact of economic sanctions, and that is a major reason why Iran has moved towards a greater willingness to talk without preconditions. But we mustn't forget either the decision they took summer last year to start tackling the potential military dimension issues left over in their dialogue with the IAEA. So they have been of a mind to move towards a more open posture for some months. Secondly, the military part of the context. Here I agree with those who've spoken before me to suggest that this has been very much two-edged. Covert actions, Stuxnet, etc., will have increased the weight within the Iranian system of those who think that Iran ought to be more explicit within its own system about having a nuclear weapons capability. And after all, those military coercive measures, the covert action that has actually taken place, has had almost negligible impact on the speed with which Iran develops its nuclear program. Third part of the setting, the cultural one, absolutely crucial to appreciate not just what David was telling us about the way in which Iran is viewed in the United States and elsewhere, and also in Israel, as Asaf made clear, but that we also think about the Iranian set of preconceptions. They think that being modern requires them to achieve scientific progress. They rest this on their history of endeavor in previous centuries, and on the fact that their own pride in their civilization, their nationalism, finds expression in a considerable rate of production of valuable scientific papers. They're also convinced that being modern and projecting strength are allied, and that nuclear technology has a whole series of spin-offs and benefits which we might regard as somewhat marginal, whether it's medical or agricultural, but they have created for themselves an image of this range of advantages which their country would gain from continuing to develop their programs. And finally, it's closely related to their sense of both of internal and external mission to do the work of Islam, consolidating the strength of their revolution within their own society, and by not conceding to foreign pressures, consolidating their external mission of being the vanguard of Islam. So being very cautious about the ways in which they might make concessions is an integral part of their cultural and political preconceptions in the ways that I've described. And finally, on the setting, the intelligence picture is absolutely crucial, as we have heard, and at present, not only does there appear, as Asaf suggested, to be some confidence in the picture which is being gained of what the Iranians are doing, but also, as Scott said, there is no reason to amend the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate of the United States that Iran has not taken a decision to weaponize. Now, moving on to the diplomatic solution. Everybody says they want one. But there are, of course, many different schools of thought. Iran wants a diplomatic solution, but I would suggest that they condition that to accepting the solution if the costs of that solution are bearable. And I believe that they would also prefer to move towards a diplomatic solution when they are closer to nuclear pregnancy. I don't believe they intend to give birth, but I do think they wish that surge capability which nuclear pregnancy would give them. Second school of thought, the non-aligned, they're inclined to give Iran the benefit of the doubt, and they're very attached to the idea of protecting NPT rights. There's Israel, the United States, and the right within the EU, the right within the United States, I should say, and I think within the EU, the right would probably include Sarkozy's government, although maybe their days are numbered. I liken their posture to the posture of the highwayman. In this case, it's your nuclear program or your life. But it's not, in my view, any more guaranteed a method to make a serious impact on the wealth of the victim, in this case, Iran's nuclear program, in the long term. Next school of thought, this one I'm proud to say includes me, and I give myself the grand title of being a realist. It includes Russia and China. These are the people who want a diplomatic solution, but think actually it's possible to conceive of a plan under which the bottom lines of all sides could be achieved. And then there's the final group, whom I label the cautious, who think, well, possibly there could be a plan, but we're not convinced that Iran's ever prepared to negotiate seriously, so we're having to go step by step. And this group includes the United Kingdom government, United States government, Germany, EU member states generally. What about the principles and the processes for achieving a planned settlement? And I think here I'm hoping to give you some chapter and verse to follow on from what we've heard both from Nick Wheeler and Naomi. First, on the basic points regarding negotiations. Iran will need early on to be given a clear idea of the end state objective for its nuclear program envisaged by the six. Secondly, of course, Iran should affirm its intention not to construct nuclear weapons once more, and it should act accordingly. Then the E3, the six should publicly accept that Iran will enrich uranium under its NPT rights for peaceful purposes, long term. There should be enhanced verification as designed by the IAEA. At the end of the nuclear stages of a negotiation, all nuclear-related sanctions should be lifted, and a goal of the process should be explicitly to normalize Iran's position as an NPT party. And the nuclear arrangements themselves, as negotiated, should be accompanied by agreements to resolve as many as possible of the other outstanding issues between Iran and the other parties. So those, I think, are the basic principles. Now, moving on, I'll say a little bit more, very briefly, about that last principle, resolving as many as possible of the other outstanding issues. And here I want to refer to an article which I think ought to get headline billing now by Ariel Levite about the examples of states who have rowed back from their nuclear weapons intentions and capabilities, and how that was achieved, and particularly the role of the United States in achieving it. Unfortunately, it's somewhere buried in my computer. I can't cite the exact date. I think it's early this decade, but it's before we all got stuck into the weeds of this nuclear negotiation. But he reminds us how important contact and dialogue, the general diplomatic process, the reduction of threat perceptions has been in doing to other countries what we explicitly want of Iran nowadays. So learn from what has worked in the past is a basic principle, I believe. And it really involves three processes. One is the detail of the eventual end state and how you get there for Iran's nuclear program. One is about regional security issues, how you instill a greater sense of confidence in the countries of the region as to the intentions of others towards others. And thirdly, starting to reduce the areas of disagreement between the United States and Iran. Now, processes. That classification of those three tracks, if you like, makes clear one key organizing concept, that you do need parallel tracks. You can't lump everything together in this negotiation. Secondly, avoidance of preconditions. And the fact that Iran walked back from its Istanbul 2011 preconditions is why I say that so far as the Istanbul 2012 talks were concerned, it was Iran that moved the furthest to make the limited success in Istanbul possible. The other side, the six, camped on the position they sketched out in the invitation letter that Catherine Ashton wrote in November 2011, where she talked about the three key words, namely step-by-step, NPT, and reciprocity. In other words, these three key concepts which emerged as potentially optimistic or upward, forward-looking concepts from the Istanbul 2012 talk are there in her letter. She somewhat spoiled the impression in her letter of November, setting it all in the context of fulfilling the United Nations Security Council resolutions, which are all about suspending things and ceasing to do things. But still, that's what the starting point for the six was stepped out in that letter. And the third under process I'd like to say is that the severity of the problem, the complexity of the problem, the degree of the mistrust requires that agreed steps under the nuclear heading be phased. Detailed negotiation is required for each, and there should be a balance of advantage to each side in each phase. I think getting a successful negotiation will require a more intensive approach by both sides than we've had over the last several years. And it will require negotiators who are fully empowered from the top level in the fact that Khamenei expressly said before Istanbul 2012 that Jalili was speaking with his authority was very significant, and we need the same on the American side, so that the Iranians know that Wendy Sherman, or whoever it is not just big in the State Department under Hillary Clinton, but she's also big in Obama's eyes. And then let's forget that if the United States and Iran on their track are having difficulty getting things going together, and this is a huge domestic problem in Iran still for Iran to be seen talking to the United States, then they shouldn't be shy of using facilitators quietly and behind the scenes. So I'm running out of time, I'm sure. I don't know how long I've spoken for, but I should say a little bit about the kind of phased proposal which might end in everybody's bottom lines being better net than they are at present. People will have to accept that there is no such thing as absolute security. And in a way, we've lost what we knew during the Cold War period, which is that you minimize the risks through appropriate arrangements, but you can't get away from the fact that it's a dangerous and uncertain world. The demand in Israel and the United States that their defense be placed so far ahead of any potential future eventuality as, for most of the history that we're talking about Iran nuclear, that Iran shouldn't even know these things. And then we moved on to Iran shouldn't ever be able to enrich anything. But these demands have resulted in massive overbidding over the years, and we've let the best be the enemy of the good. Now, that's an important principle that we should try and hoist into the current intergovernmental debates. So risk management is the name of the game. And after all, we are, as everybody recognizes, in an extremely risky situation at the moment for all parties, for Iran and for the six countries, and also for the countries of the region. And I think there's just a glimmer of hope that both parties, all parties, realize that they can't achieve their security bottom lines using the policies that they have currently in force. I do get this sense from what limited contacts I have with the United States that this is starting to dawn. I do get that sense from limited contacts with the British government, and I do think that's starting to emerge in Iran, although that's very hard to deduce, and one is reliant very much on Iranian intermediaries who may be party free themselves or trying to flog a particular agenda or speak for particular factions. But it doesn't seem to me that the Iranians are in a good place, and increasingly I believe they are aware they're in both a bad and a dangerous place. So, sorry, phasing. This year, given what we heard from Adam about the difficulties of the United Nations election campaign, it's impossible to conceive of a full negotiation succeeding in one go, one uninterrupted process. I do believe that it's not in the interests either of Iran or of the United States to be seen to be responsible for a breakdown. And that is going to be quite a significant force in finding procedural fixes to allow people to move from one meeting to another and to move, hopefully, towards an outline of a preliminary agreement which could be reached in 2012, which would start to defuse the situation. The obvious candidate for such a preliminary agreement is the one that was talked about in 2009 and 2010 about the Tehran research reactor versus Iran no longer enriching to 20%, which has been offered on numerous occasions by the Iranians and would be a significant reduction of the perception of risk in the eyes of the six, should that be actually negotiable. If Iran was to, for example, suspend future 20% enrichment and adopt a 5% enrichment cap and allow the IAEA to monitor under seal all the 20% LEU that they have achieved until it's exported in return for receipt of the fuel plates for the Tehran research reactor from overseas, then they're going to have something in return, and that's clearly going to be fought over because it will give the impression of weakness, quote unquote, in the United States, Israel, and elsewhere. But the obvious candidate is not implementing some or all of the sanctions on the Central Bank of Iran and on oil export. And Iran is already signaling through its media that relief from sanctions is what it regards as the test of the sincerity of the other side. Clearly, any future stabilization, risk reduction has got to include a great many important elements. And I'm not going to try and divide them for you into phases, just to suggest what Iran will have to do. It will have to stop creating new kinds of fancy centrifuge. It would have to freeze its enrichment capacity at a certain level. It will have to account for the potential military dimensions. It will have to implement the additional protocol to its safeguards agreement and the disputed safeguards code 3.1 about notification of new facilities. It's going to have to confirm that it has no plans for reprocessing. That's confirmation of the present situation. It's going to have to somehow deal with the Arak reactor issue, defer its completion, or accept a light water reactor in return for not completing it. It's got to actually put its commitments to the additional protocol into its law, which it hasn't done hitherto through ratification, and maybe it's got to calibrate all future LEU production to its immediate reactor needs and any future internationally accepted export contracts that it might have. On the other side, at some point or other, the six has got to say, right, we're not going to implement new sanctions. We are going to, in the United States case, stop bullying other states into observing United States sanctions, because that's in many ways the most effective tool against Iran. SWIFT is obviously going to have to be restored at some point. The six are going to have to, as Naomi suggested, introduce an amnesty should Iran come clean. I think the issue there is not whether at some point an amnesty is declared for any revealed past nuclear weapons research and development work, but at what point it is allowed. In other words, how much transparency Iran has to give in return for that. Now, that's a sort of after you, Claude, problem. And my view is that that amnesty's got to come up front, because we'll just have continued stalemate, like we have now between the IAEA and Iran on the potential military dimensions, unless there is something well and truly clear about non-use to further penalize Iran of any honesty on their part about things they have done. The states are going to have to offer Iran cooperation on peaceful nuclear technology, which has, after all, been in every proposal made since 2005. Lifting of UN sanctions I've already mentioned. And now the really difficult one, which is what about sanctions that the US administration can't lift because they're congressionally mandated, and we all have visions of the Netanyahu speech to Congress the other day, those 28, was it, standing ovations, and the difficulty of actually giving Iran that which it would deserve if it agreed to the whole gamut of demands upon it, but which might be regarded by the regime changers as totally inadequate. So that is a huge imponderable. United States politics, Iranian politics is another huge imponderable. The degree to which Iran will say, well, moderating our hostilities to the United States is something we can accept, it's not contrary to the interests of the revolution. And clearly the influences which Israel brings to bear, they could, because they are, in my view, the dominant influence on Western policy making, unfortunately, because their interests don't coincide with UK and European interests and even American interests always, in my view, but they clearly have a very significant capability to influence the success or otherwise of such a delicate negotiation. So, a measure of secrecy is going to have to be required also to maintain a calm atmosphere in order to minimize the kind of public spoiling which can very easily take place from premature disclosures. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Three very interesting presentations, and I let them flow without the demands of time, precisely because they were so interesting. But that raises a number of questions, of course. I thought they were all complementary and a juxtaposition to some of the discussion earlier, in that they lay out some of the possibilities of de-escalation and resolution.